Week 3 of the Lindsay Clancy trial has officially wrapped up. We've heard 13 days of testimony so far, and to break down everything we heard this week, I am joined by WBZ legal analyst Jennifer Roman. And Jennifer, the biggest takeaway, I think, from most people who followed the trial this week was what happened Wednesday when Lindsay Clancy was seemingly inconsolable. The judge called 2 breaks. As someone in the courtroom, her sobs were so loud. And people that were watching from home on the live stream said they could even hear them through the camera. So I think a lot of people are wondering, what impact is that having on the jury? And why does she have to sit there through all of this gruesome testimony? I'm seeing a lot of comments online asking, can't the defense just sit in for her? Like, why does she have to be present?
So to start with the second half of that question, she doesn't need to be present. She has a right to be present, but she does not need to be present. And I think the question is, at some point, Judge Sullivan may tell her she needs to leave the courtroom if her emotions remain so unchecked that it continues to be disruptive to the trial. Judge Sullivan's got an obligation to keep the trial moving forward, to keep it moving with as little disruption as possible. And we saw just, on Wednesday, multiple breaks so that Lindsay Clancy could sort of compose herself and calm down a bit to be able to sit through that testimony. So she doesn't need to be there. It's a choice. How is this affecting the jury? I think it could go either way for them. At first, I thought this was really humanizing her for the jury because up
Mhm.
until this point, she's pretty much been, looking ahead or looking down. She hasn't shown us a whole lot. We're not hearing from her. We may never hear from her in terms of testimony. So I thought that her showing some emotion and sadness about what these horrible, just, horrific facts, I thought it was important that the jury see that in her. But now it's kind of like, you did this. Nobody's disputing that you did this. The question is why you did it. And she can't compose herself and sort of pull it back in and rein it back in sufficiently, she's going to be asked to leave. And the jurors may not like that. The jury may feel like she's impeding and slowing down the trial, that this is more drama from her. If the jurors are aligned with the prosecution's theories, and Lindsay Clancy continues to have these kinds of significant outbursts that she's not able to rein in and control, this could feed into the prosecution's theory. So I think it's, we never know what's in the jurors' minds, but I think this could, initially I thought good for her. It demonstrates some humanity. Now I'm starting to feel like she's playing into the prosecution's theory a little bit, and that may not be a good thing for her.
Interesting. I was kind of shocked after that second break was called, after she kind of cried out, I can't do it. I thought court would be done for the day. It was already kind of the end of the day. It was around 3:30. They typically end testimony at 4. They called us back into the courtroom and she was still there. And we heard more testimony from the medical examiner. And then to that point, she was not the only person crying in that courtroom. Several of the jurors were crying too. I can't imagine how hard this has been on the 18 jurors that are seated in this case. And primarily, they're women. We have 12 women, 6 men. I saw all female jurors crying. One of the jurors looked like she was really struggling through the autopsy testimony. Because remember, they're seeing those screens of what I imagine are horrific photos of the children. If Lindsay is so upset by just even hearing the description of the photos, these jurors are also seeing the photos. I mean, it could go both ways, I think. I think some of these women could maybe sympathize with Lindsay, think, maybe I also struggle with my postpartum mental health. Or could these women think, oh, this is a monster? How could someone do this to their kids? I mean, the fact that it's mostly women and they're getting very emotional, how do you think that could help either side in this case?
This is a very emotional case, the likes of which I don't think we haven't seen in many, many years. So I think that this case is hard to follow as an observer, and it has to be incredibly difficult to listen to as a juror and to know that you're making a decision around this. I think it's hard on the legal teams. It's just a horrible case all around. And we've had Judge Sullivan tell the jurors more than once now, you're deciding this case on the facts and the evidence and the legal standards. You can't bring your emotions into it. And I think jurors really do try to honor that. I mean, they do really try very hard to follow the law and to listen to the instructions of the judge. But at the end of the day, they're human. How does this not impact you? And again, this goes back to sort of the different theories. It depends on who I'm leaning towards. If I'm a juror who's leaning towards the prosecution, I'm looking at this woman thinking, you're a monster. You not only did this to one child, you did it to three. No matter what your mental health state was, that is just beyond cruel. And I can't even conceive of it. You're a monster. There's no other explanation. If I'm a juror who's leaning towards the defense, I'm thinking here's a woman who was crying out for help, telling her provider she was having intrusive thoughts, telling her provider she didn't like how she was feeling on certain medications, and was really trying, and the system was failing her. So I think it kind of depends on which way a juror might be leaning at this particular moment. But if I take a step back and look to what the prosecution has been able to do this past week, I think the prosecution got some real momentum in their case this week. Up until this point, I was pretty candid. I thought they were struggling. And this week, I feel like it's coming together for them. I think they're pulling out nuggets of information that support their theory that she wasn't psychotic on the day that she did this. She wasn't showing signs of psychosis, according to her treatment providers, in the weeks leading up until to these murders. In fact, she seemed to be improving. Patrick Clancy confirmed she seemed to be improving. We then have, I thought, what was very chilling were the notes that Lindsay Clancy had written in her phone that were read through testimony today by one of the troopers, talking about having resentment to the older two children because she couldn't care and love Cal the same way she could her first. Talking about having this internal conflict about her whole life wanting to have a lot of kids. She doesn't think she wanted Cal to be, she didn't think she wanted Cal to be their last child, but she, had to do a lot of soul searching because it was such a struggle to have the three of them. And really feeling a lot of guilt and almost it seemed like anger about not being able to care for her third child the same way you'd be able to care for when you only had one child. And that to me was sort of really supporting and bolstering the prosecution's theory here. Then we had that, I think what kind of came as a surprise to me, that she had Googled psychosis 5 days before the killings. So why would you do that? Right? Again, depending on where I'm leaning, I could go different theories on
Mm-hmm.
this. But right now, having really only heard the prosecution's case with some cross-examination by the defense, which is letting us see their theory. I'm thinking she did this as part of this, this cover-up, this show. It was part of her premeditation. And certainly the defense is going to argue she did that because she was so desperate and was so worried and trying to figure out what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this week, a lot of the mental health testimony really sort of lent itself to the prosecution. She talked about intrusive thoughts, but then also said those intrusive thoughts would abate or subside when she took Ativan. She talked, the providers are very clear there was no specific intent for suicide, no specific intent to harm the children. Rebecca Gelada, the nurse practitioner, said she saw, she was reporting and saw depression, anxiety. Lindsay Clancy was reporting insomnia. Rebecca Gelada said she raised the issue of bipolar, of there possibly being bipolar with Patrick Clancy, and he was adamant saying, no, she's not bipolar. And we have, Rebecca Gelada saying there was no intent. She never, she talked about intrusive thoughts, but she was not concerned about the risk to the children at all or a risk to Lindsay, because if there was, they would have elevated her care. Letitia Duke's mental health counselor said the same thing. She said she approached her medical records with a sort of from a clean slate, right? She didn't read everything. She wanted to take a fresh look at it and assess for herself if the treatment protocol seemed to be appropriate. She wasn't concerned about Lindsay Clancy and the children. And in fact, she seemed to be doing better. She was able to laugh and engage in their therapy in their sessions differently than she had in the weeks prior. So all things are sort of pointing, at least in the final 2 weeks leading up to the murders, as things were better. Things seem to be better, and that's helpful for the prosecution.
Well, talking about the prosecution's theory, something I found interesting, if we go back to their opening statements, they painted this picture that Lindsay was trying to paint herself as a victim, that she was faking all of this in a premeditated plan to kill her children. But if you're listening to testimony this week, it more sounded like their argument was that she mismanaged her care, which to me just sounded a little bit like a deviation from what they were arguing in their opening statements. Do you think that they plan to bring those two together, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to make and a very valid point because we have seen the prosecution sort of, they seem to be shifting and responding to the pressure placed upon them by the defense team. If they tried to back off of the fake suicide theory. Now, remind you, prosecution never used the words fake suicide. That was something labeled by the defense that the prosecution sort of adopted somewhat and then felt the need to sort of distance themselves from. So that was sort of a shift there. Earlier last week, we saw that where there was a suggestion by the prosecution of, well, we never said it was a fake suicide. We just said that it was an attempt that she knew would not be successful. Is there a difference there? I'm not so sure, right? You may not
Mm.
like the labeling of fake suicide, and I understand that, but underlining, isn't it just word salad? I mean, aren't you kind of saying the same thing? And then this week, we sort of saw this shift from, well, she was manipulating the doctors to prescribe her medications to suit her. Now it's okay, well, she wasn't doing that necessarily, but she wasn't reporting everything to the doctors. She wasn't being candid with them about how she was feeling and what was going on. She wasn't being candid with her husband about her treatment. Nobody knows if she was truly complying with all of the medication regimens that she was under. We may never know that. And so there does seem to be, again, a subtle shift in how they're prosecuting this. And, to your point, are they going to confuse the jury that way? Is the jury going to find the prosecution less credible because they feel like maybe things are shifting underneath them? And the jurors don't like that, right? They want to know what your theory is. They want something concrete. They want to understand where you're going and why you're going. They don't want to think about how the puzzle pieces fit into complex legal issues. They want you to make that roadmap for them
Right.
and they can assess, was that sufficient? Did the prosecution meet their burden? And here, the prosecution, by sort of shifting, maybe losing some jurors by doing that. Subtle shifts, but I think enough that the jury's like, wait a minute, that's not what you said before. That's not what you told us before. Now we're a little confused. What is your theory? And that can be damaging for the prosecution for sure.
Sure, it'll be interesting come closing arguments how similar they are to the opening statements. But okay, we talked about it being a pretty decent week for the prosecution in terms of them making their argument, kind of getting their stride. The defense has also had some good moments, I think, on cross-examination this week. I mean, we talk about psychosis. Kevin Reddington had that one doctor admit that, when a psychosis hits you, it just hits you like bang. And the doctor was like, yeah, that is true. So just that point alone could show that this came out of nowhere for Lindsay. I think another good moment of cross-examination was when we were going over those Google searches, and she did search hallucinations because remember, the defense this week tried to get ahead of the prosecution's theory that a doctor told her to
Mhm.
say to Patrick Clancy, her then husband, that she was having hallucinations. But here we see that she searched hallucinations. So it was the first time we kind of had like a third party piece of evidence surrounding hallucinations specifically. Are there any other good cross-examination moments that you found from this week?
I think that those were really good cross-examination moments and very important for the defense. And I do think the defense has done a very good job of picking away at the prosecution's theory as along the way with certain moments. I think another sort of really good cross-examination moment was with with the medical providers. I think, I think the defense did a good job with Letitia Dukes sort of coming down on her for taking this fresh set of eyes on this complex postpartum case, right? I mean, I think Letitia Dukes did a good job explaining why she did that, but I also think it was an important point for the defense to say, you went into this cold. You had no idea what this person's prior history was. And this is a complicated case. And I think that that was important for them. I think the Googling of the hallucinations, the Googling of the psychosis, I think that that's telling too. Again, it could go either way, right? It could be the prosecution saying that was part of the premeditation, but where that sort of fell, the timing of that testimony and how it fell on the heels of her not having a specific intent and somebody being able to shift from not being in a psychotic state to going into a psychotic state, that it can happen very quickly and switch back very quickly too, was important for the defense.
It seems they will put on a lot of witnesses, I assume, talking about these prescription medications, what it can do to the brain. I mean, we're already 3 weeks into this trial. We've heard from 71 witnesses. This is a long trial. What, in your expertise, do you think we could expect going forward? I'm anticipating several more weeks of testimony.
The trial has been moving at a good clip. In the beginning, again, the prosecution didn't seem quite ready. They didn't seem to have witnesses lined up when the testimony went faster than they had anticipated, but that seems to have been cured by now. And now they're sort of steadily going. They've got their witnesses lined up and ready to go. But there is an extraordinary number of witnesses in this case, and we haven't even gotten to the prosecution's experts who are going to talk about postpartum depression and psychosis. And then, of course, we're going to have the defense putting on their case, which is probably going to be heavily expert dependent. We're certainly going to hear from Dr. Ziesel, who was the psychiatrist retained by the defense to work with Lindsay Clancy. He met with her when she was still in the hospital. No doubt he conducted psychological testing on her, at least I would expect so. And he's going to be, I think, a big thrust of their case, and it's going to probably likely be technical testimony. And we're also going to hear about how these kinds of medications and drugs can tip somebody who may be bipolar into a psychotic state, because that's something the defense has previewed for the jury, is that somebody with severe postpartum depression, that can lead to a bipolar disorder. And by taking certain medications, including SSRIs, which are the antidepressants and the anti-anxieties, that can exacerbate bipolar, and then that can lead to a psychosis, a state of psychosis. So the defense has got to start to fill in these various components of their theory still. And then we're going to have potentially rebuttal by the prosecution. The prosecution will be able to call witnesses again to rebut any sort of new testimony that came in through the defense. So I think we've got several more weeks of this trial to go before this ever gets in the hands of the jury.
And I do think that is a good argument by the defense to say she was undiagnosed bipolar. This is what these drugs we know do to people with bipolar disorder. But then I wonder if the prosecution would just come back and say, well, she was presented with the possibility of being bipolar, and both her and her husband were not at all entertaining that idea. A lot of the testimony or facts in this case, I feel like, can benefit either side depending on how they argue them and what the jury thinks.
I think that's spot on. That is absolutely spot on. And I think it's important for both sides. It's always important for the prosecution defense to build and maintain credibility with the jury. And the defense is going to do that by having these doctors talk about the evolution of mental health when somebody starts with postpartum depression and then starts to evolve into more serious illnesses, potentially bipolar, potentially a psychotic state. That's how they're going to do it. The prosecution has been doing it by building these blocks of Lindsay Clancy being an active participant in her treatment plan, engaging with professionals, being a nurse herself, having a deeper understanding of medications and mental health than, let's say, somebody who's not in the medical field would, and really sort of in picking and choosing the information she was sharing with her providers, right? That she was totally in control and she chose, I mean, this is part of their shifting that we talked about in their theory, but she chose not to access the treatment available to her to prevent this from ever happening. To prevent herself from becoming suicidal, to prevent herself from becoming psychotic, that she made those choices and chose a different path, which ultimately led to these murders. So the credibility here, on both sides is really going to be heavy because I think that, as you said, the evidence could kind of go either way. Um,
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, I think one of the toughest burdens for the prosecution is saying it was explaining how somebody who's been described as a loving, doting mother who was a labor and delivery nurse could do this unless she was out of her mind.
And
And
that's a high bar to reach. I think a lot of people, whether you know this case or not, think, well, someone must have been experiencing a mental break to do something so horrific. And it's a high bar, I think, for the prosecution to overcome that natural thought that most of us have.
for sure. I mean, there's jurors, we all have biases, real and implicit, right? And there's definitely the bias that a mother wouldn't do this to her children, and that she wouldn't do this to her children unless she was suffering from some sort of mental break, a psychosis. So that is difficult. And the prosecution bears that burden beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to show, we're a minority state in that regard. We push the burden of proving somebody's soundness of mind and ability to understand right from wrong and criminality on the prosecution. And they carry the same burden they would have just proving the fact that she actually did these murders. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's really hard when nobody is
Mhm.
actually in the defendant's head at the moment that these things are happening. We're all looking at it, we're all sort of unpacking it from over here, and nobody was there in the moment with her. So it's difficult for sure.
And I would be shocked personally if she testified. I mean, you can speak more on that, but my last question on that note of witnesses is something else that happened this week was the potential new witness on the defense's side, that woman who was a former employee of McLean Hospital, where Lindsay Clancy spent a few days after, New Year's. She had a really bad time, went to the emergency room. They sent her to McLean. She checked out early because she said she wanted to go to her daughter's birthday party. We saw that former employee make that now viral TikTok. It has millions of views talking about what it was like to work at McLean, what their staffing may have been over a holiday weekend, New Year's. Do you think they will actually end up testifying? I'm really curious. A lot of people online are hoping they do, but I see the judge's concern of, can we really let someone testify who's been following this whole trial?
Yeah, and the concern, if that's one concern, the other concern is the temporality of it. This person wasn't working at McLean's when Lindsay Clancy was there.
Correct. It was
They
about a
have
year prior.
Yeah, they have no idea what kind of treatment she actually received. They have no idea how much of the treatments that were offered to her that she was actually accessing, right? There's been some dispute around whether or not she was, so far the prosecution testimony is that she turned down opportunities to participate in therapy sessions and engage with the treatments that were being provided to her outside of taking a medication regimen. So I think that that's really going to be an issue. And, the testimony, if it comes out how we expect it to, based upon the TikTok videos that are out there, it would be very prejudicial to the prosecution. And I don't think they've got a way to effectively rebut that, short of bringing in somebody else from McLean's. And then it becomes this issue of, was McLean's, this one singular institution who had her in their care for 5 days, the reason why she ended up in a psychotic state? And I don't think the judge is going to allow this person to testify for those reasons, the temporality, the relevance, and the highly degree of prejudice to the prosecution. And this already lengthy trial would have even more potential to become completely unwieldy and just sort of go on and on and on. Because when do you stop? When do you cut off, the testimony around what's going on at McLean's? McLean's isn't on trial. It's Lindsay Clancy.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And the judge did say he would prefer someone who currently works there or had worked there at the time that Lindsay was there. But I imagine it would be very difficult to get a current employee of an institution to agree to testify.
Oh, that would be employment suicide, right? You come out and you speak against your employer in a very highly publicized trial, they're not going to have a job, and they may not have a job in that field ever again, right? Because now they've
Mhm.
become a liability. So I don't think anyone who currently works there is going to be able to testify. And I don't think that this TikTok person who used to work at McLean's but wasn't there at the time of Lindsay Clancy's treatment is going to be able to testify either.
Well, we'll see what happens. The judge hasn't ruled on it yet, and we still have a long way to go in this trial. The prosecution hasn't rested its case yet, although I thought they would have, because it does seem that they've gone through most of their key witnesses. But the defense will be up likely next week. The prosecution will rebuttal that. So a lot more still to come. But Jennifer Roman, thank you so much for chatting about it with us.
You're welcome.